the interesting thing about Improbable is that we're basically total outsiders from the games industry. I'm a computer scientist. I've never shipped a game. We hire quite a lot of veteran game developers, but predominantly we're ex-academics, ex-Googlers, we're from finance, from hedge funds. You know, our parties are awesome. The people that we've put together really are more passionate about solving hard technical challenges. And what I think is interesting is that outsider perspective can sometimes be very provocative when it comes into an industry that can be a little closed. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about what I think is the big iceberg problem in gaming. And if I succeed today, what I'll do is I might provoke a little conversation that would leave this room too, about what could potentially be a very unusual solution to this iceberg problem. And what is the problem that I'm talking about? Well, it's the problem of content. One of the fascinating things about Torsten's talk just before us, and why I asked that question, is that it still feels as though the pursuit of a fun experience involves building more content. More levels, more NPCs, more monsters, more areas. I mean, consumers, they just consume this content at a ridiculous rate. They'll consume it faster than we can ever build it. And I think this leads to some fundamental problems that are almost like physical laws that we just have to accept. And one of them, really, is that with the rising cost, we kind of ask the question, what happened to my fun? What happened to my content? So, in the halcyon days of gaming for me, which was 1995, by the way, just so that everyone knows that, there were experiences, RPG games, big world games, large games, which had many, many choices in them, choices driven by content. I mean, in this little game that we devised, we see this really rubbish graphical character, but we see wonderful options. I can slay the alien lord, find galactic treasure, save the spaceport, do all manner of awesome things. With time, we see the production value increases, but the number of choices available to users decreases, right? Eventually, we reach a situation where we have beautiful experiences, but very little in the way of meaningful choice or meaningful progression in games. And this isn't necessarily a problem that only affects core games. So even in the mobile space, where it's traditionally been quite cheap to build more content and to do more and to do it faster, as production values increase, we will see this problem again. There's another issue, too, associated with a reliance on content. And it comes from when we consider what happens in the online world. So I don't know if anyone here is an MMO fan or an online game or RPG fan, but you see an interesting trend in worlds that are driven by scripted content or static content, which is that all of our little users here ultimately get the same experience. And what's worse, whatever they do, whether they kill the dragon, stand idly in front of it, or don't kill the dragon, ultimately, in the end, the world resets, and their actions carry no meaning. Things happen all over again. So this problem is one that has nothing to do with content price. It's about simply the fact that we can't really create compelling shared experiences when nothing that we do matters, when nothing that we do can really affect the world. But there's a bigger problem, well, a smaller problem in my mind, but you guys might be concerned about it, which is that, in our view, an over-reliance of content will eventually destroy human civilization. Ah, see, that woke up some people, right? Absolutely. But let me tell you what I mean. And this is kind of something that many of you veteran developers will really understand and know about. The cost of a mainstream game in 2000, it was expensive, but it wasn't completely out of the realms of possibility. Now to build something with meaningful and significant production values that hits a huge audience can get unbelievably expensive and take a lot of people. I mean, in fact, the trends are so ridiculous that we actually plotted some data. And this is a facetious kind of exponential argument. But eventually, you find that the next blockbuster title involves the entire population of the Earth, costs the GDP of America, and based on our previous argument, the game lasts all of 5 minutes. So clearly, an over-reliance on content can't necessarily take us forward. And I want to make this point. New consoles, new ways of consuming games, especially VR, create even greater content requirements among developers. I mean, VR requires even more attention to detail, even more artistic work to create compelling, immersive experiences. So what's the solution? Now, I would say there isn't really a silver bullet solution to this problem. I mean, people have tried user-generated content. People have tried simpler experiences. People have tried all manner of things. In our view, we think the solution could be simulation. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And it may not be the kind of simulation you guys are familiar with. So what is simulation? Well, basically, it's fun through a generative system, right? If anyone's lost hours to Gary's mod or anything else, you can see that sometimes even a fixed palette of assets in a system of rules can create all manner of fun experiences. There are simulation games out there. Dwarf Fortress, for those of you who are very masochistic when it comes to graphics. And many others, The Sims being very classic, and so many other experiences. But here's the issue that we see, and it's that fundamentally, as outsiders, as computer scientists, we see this as the age of weak simulation, because we're still applying simulation techniques within the context of a traditional game engine. What do I mean by that? I mean your AI, your world process, whatever you have, it's still being done and still fighting for resources with all of the other aspects of game development that consume them. I mean, in the end, the developer must choose, right, between connectedness, graphical fidelity, real-time interaction, and simulation. You can't have it all. You can't build the big, compelling online universe that we've been promised so many times with the high production values, but also with powerful simulation backing it. I mean, there are very challenging, fundamental technical issues associated with scaling what we have now as an industry. What is a good way of maybe thinking about it is that the per-entity simulation budget, so what I mean by that is if all of us here were in a simulation, the amount of processing time I could spend on any one of you, or we could all have assigned to us, is below the threshold needed to create what could be a truly immersive experience with no scripts, where all the fun, all the behavior came from that simulation. So I want to do something now which I've always wanted to do. And as my first kind of speaking engagement, I'm really hoping that it succeeds. I want to coin a phrase, and anyone who uses this phrase, I will personally buy a drink to over the course of the next 2 days, right? But it's a phrase that I want to use to really hammer home what I mean, and it is the idea of strong simulation. Saw that coming, right? And the idea is very simple. The idea is that you have a hypothetical technology or a hypothetical way of building games in which we can throw as much simulation as we like as developers to creating behavior, to creating processes like ecologies, economies, all of the things that can create deeply immersive experience for gamers, which might sound kind of far-fetched, but bear with me here. And the interesting thing is, actually, if we think about it, this means that the world can be completely reactive. We can have a persistent simulation, a global simulation, one in which, if I leave something on the floor or if I kill an NPC, there are meaningful consequences to these actions. And those meaningful consequences can start to create new gameplay experiences, new kinds of fun, which are not content heavy. And really, the main idea is this. Strong simulation is about having no trade-off between powerful simulation, graphical fidelity, connectedness, or real-time interaction. And this is the cool part that we've discovered over the last 2 years. If you want to do this, necessarily you're talking about a distributed simulation. You're talking about taking the simulation out of the context of a game engine and doing it somewhere else. And that opens up this wonderful can of worms of technical challenges associated with achieving that. And it's fascinating, but because these simulations are distributed, that kind of implies these games would need to be connected. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about an example to kind of sum this up. I want to try and hopefully provoke some thought about what a game could be like which had strong simulation backing it, but also had no compromise between real-time interaction, production values, and all of the things that we've come to love in experiences. So I've actually devised a game for you guys here, and this is in the public domain. You can use this game if you'd like. It's called The Land of Generica. And for a moment, I'm going to need you guys to use your imagination. So imagine for a moment that this world is a wonderful, immersive 3D experience. Let's make it an Oculus Rift game. Let's use as much production as we like to build a beautiful experience. So at first glance, right, we have kind of some of the same problems as before. We have to build these mountains, these forests, these rivers, those wonderful 2 towns, weather systems, resources. And we've got players, we've got NPCs, we've got the triangle monster and his triangle buddies, right? So we have a situation here with this world where there's still a degree of content that needs to be built. But because this is a strongly simulated game, immediately we start to see some very interesting differences. The first is, if we take the players out, the game is still interesting. NPCs are still going about their business doing things. Monsters are still hunting. Larger monsters and smaller monsters are having their own interaction. We see a world that is interesting to watch. And for me, that's the hallmark of a strongly simulated experience, because it means when you bring the players back in and you get them to do something, like, for example, kill this giant isosceles demon, equilateral, someone measure that, I'm not sure. We see that this can create effects that nobody really imagined. Because this game is strongly simulated, that body persists. Because it persists, it can become food for something else. We actually encountered this problem totally by accident in a demo that we were building ourselves. And it became a real issue because these creatures eating that corpse began to multiply. And having multiplied, they became a threat unto themselves. And that has a knock-on effect that nobody imagined. So what we see here isn't just interesting simulated gameplay. We see an emergent narrative. We see a narrative that the developers didn't write, the players didn't create, no one anticipated, which is possible because the world is interesting even if we do nothing. And this can go on and on and on. The fun doesn't need to end. We can see NPCs being drawn back to a town built by the players. We can see the players eventually deciding to rise up and reclaim their original town. And this sort of continuous knock-on effect, it takes games from being games, really, to being something else. Some sort of hybrid between a virtual world and a storytelling experience where the players really are in charge of doing that. And ultimately, truly getting distributed simulation right, strong simulation right, means that we can start doing things at scale, right? We can start adding more hardware. We can start adding bigger and badder worlds to systems that previously have been very limited. And that can start to do what I think really is perhaps the future of connected gaming. Big, collaborative, cooperative, immersive experiences where we're not separating players from each other, where we're able to actually share an experience together. So I think strong simulation has huge advantages. What I'm talking about here probably seems like a hypothetical pipe dream, right? Too good to be true. How can we have all of these things and still be able to build games in a cost-effective way? Well, in actual fact, I think it significantly reduces the cost of games because you can get much more fun out of the same assets. And additionally, which is really cool, a lot of what you do when building a strongly simulated game can be reused. Ideas in behavior, algorithms that are devised to think about how entities should behave or interact with the world, these are all transferable. And what would be wonderful for the throng of independent and mid-sized developers out there would be if there would be a way that we could build games where we could actually reuse what we do, where we could build on each other's work, where we could begin to build games that don't carry the same financial risk as starting from scratch over and over again. Also, I think regardless of whether simulation is the answer, the iceberg problem of content will need to be tackled at some point. It cannot be avoided. So the cool thing is the challenges aren't simply technical. In the last 2 years, we've been very quiet, but we've been talking to quite a few developers who we're now working with, and I'll be talking about one of them at the very end. And what we found is actually you give people this wonderful technology, but it isn't really about solving those challenges. It's about coming up with a whole new way to tell stories, a whole new way to think about how to build narrative in games. And I think it's kind of a brave new world, right? Ultimately, very bold moves are needed. What we will see in simulation-heavy games is gameplay and experiences that really don't resemble what we've seen before. And that might require new skills, new ways of thinking about level design when everything can move about, new ways of considering what it means really to progress in an online game where everyone is involved and participating. I'm really pleased, actually, that there's been a surprising number of people who you wouldn't expect to be prepared to change how they work and how they build games, who've surprised us. I'm pleased to be able to announce one of them today, which is Bosses Studios, who I'm really excited by wanting to work with at the moment. And what they're working on is really, really cool, and we hope to be able to talk about it soon. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, I would love to take them.
Thanks. You mentioned VR a couple of times during your talk. Is that somewhere you see the company going down? Boss are obviously one of the first VR adopters.
I couldn't possibly comment about that. What I would say is, naturally, the advantages of simulation are more pronounced in VR games. It makes things very interesting, and it lets you create more immersion without necessarily creating more content. It's this content problem that we solve. So anywhere where it's more pronounced, yes, there's an advantage.
Love you have a question down here. Oh, if you could wait for the mic.
It won't be recorded if you show. Oh, wow. Hello.
Hello.
God, that was loud. You kind of hinted at a sort of non-proprietary approach to these kind of worlds where you could see developers working together from the same assets.
Yes.
From the outside coming in, do you think that's a realistic aspiration? Is there an appetite for that?
It's really surprising, but I can tell you that a fair proportion of the developers that we're talking to have actually agreed to open source huge amounts of the content being built for their own games to be shared, because they see the value in that content progressing and then being folded back into the games that they're building. I mean, to be honest, I've been surprised by the appetite. I mean, coming into this business 2 years ago, I would never have imagined that there was. I think also that it's about being able to do it. I mean, people's tech stacks are so proprietary, they're so condensed. Everybody has their own workflow. Everybody has their own kind of proprietary game engine that they're working with. When we look more at Unity developers or independent developers, there's more commonality in what they're doing, so it's easier to share things. In particular, our technical approach is about abstracting away that behavior enough so that it's like a different dimension of sharing. You don't have to worry about which engine you're part of.
And just a quick supplementary one, if that's okay.
Sure.
It sounds like such an ambitious kind of project. And you're obviously not afraid to aim big. I mean, what is the long-term goal for you guys? I feel like you want to take over the world.
What I would say is this. I mean, we're 35 now. We continue to hire people whose ambitions, perhaps go even beyond gaming, people who really want to build new technology. We've talked a lot about things like other areas where simulation can be very powerful, and I think you'd be right in thinking we're considering those as well. Here's the thing. Whenever we talk to sort of VCs or external people and they come and see our tech, they're like, well, why are you looking at gaming? There's so many more exciting things that you can do. And I get very angry with that. I think this industry is so exciting, so powerful. I think the promise of what it can be is so much more than what it is. And I feel more people in technology need to see that. We recently poached a few people from Google, for example, and it's very hard to make them see that what we do here is as important as what they do.
What were they doing at Google and what are they doing for you?
Couldn't possibly say.
Worth a try.
Building big systems.
Cheers.